Too many alerts and not enough action? It's time to get SaltStack. SaltStack is an intelligent IT automation platform that detects security issues in critical business systems and then actually fixes them. With SaltStack, security and IT teams work together to define custom security policies with certified checks for CIS, DISA-STIGs, and more. You can scan systems for millions of compliance checks in minutes. Remediate compliance and vulnerability issues with powerful automation, all in a single platform. Visit securityweekly.com/SaltStack to learn more.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by Matt Alderman and John Kinsella. Here at SysDig, we're what you might call container obsessed. It starts with our unique technology, which listens to the heart of the operating system to surface the deepest data with the least overhead. To learn more about SysDig, visit securityweekly.com/SysDig. You can now submit your suggestions for guests in our recently released guest suggestion form. Go to securityweekly.com/guests and enter your suggestions. We've heard from our listeners that they love our content, but the amount of content we distribute can sometimes be overwhelming. We've recently released our customizable listener interest list. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe and click the button to join the listener list and let us know your interests. Matt, John, it has been a busy week of news. And I think one of the things that might start us off with is a breach. And a breach that was also entertaining because I think we might have to, or companies might have to start updating their earning call threat models to include recorders.
Yes, this is a very interesting story when you dig into it, right? Krebs gets notification, Brian Krebs gets notification from a couple internal anonymous sources that there's been a breach. He sends an email and tries to get information from them. They basically come out with some basic press response that doesn't answer any of the questions. So their earnings calls on the 16th. Krebs gets in, starts asking questions on the call. This story gets really interesting because there's a lot of, it appears to be denial of an attack when there is evidence that something actually happened here, and created a lot of interest at the earnings call for the company. So yeah, this was a very interesting article to track.
Yeah, and this was, to me, what's also interesting is that, well, one, it's, it goes back to the conversations we've already been having about supply chain. So your consultants, your contractors, are a human part of that supply chain, as well as the, insider threat. Even if it's a malicious employee or contractor, or your contractor's been compromised, that's also, interesting variations of that insider threat. But I was reading about this Wipro and Krebs, and I also, wanted to highlight this isn't, unique. This has actually happened before. So there was Operation Cloudhopper, which at least has one of the more interesting names for an APT group. This was APT 10 that was reported by BAE Systems and PwC about 4 or 5 years ago, about late 2016. And even earlier, they were seeing a bunch of state actors going after other type of managed security providers or managed service providers because guess who has access to lots of different systems, these types of organizations.
Yeah, and what's interesting in this is it looks like a traditional phishing attack that gains access into their systems. But what's interesting here is the attacker used these systems to attack Wipro's clients' environments, which is really scary when you think about it, right? Because they're a major outsourcer, lots of potential customers. Here, their systems are compromised, and they're using those compromised systems to try to compromise their customer systems. This is really scary from a threat modeling perspective. And I think if you read all the articles, because there's a couple articles linked off of this, where Brian's doing some more detailed investigation that, they hired a firm to investigate from a forensics perspective. And in the one article that's really interesting is how not to respond to an attack like this when all the evidence is pointing that you had something. This gets a little scary. And there are, in the article, it talks about specific customers that literally just stopped access from all the Wipro third-party users because they were seeing these active attacks from the system. They just literally shut them out.
Yeah, and I think, we've last couple of episodes we've been talking about asset management, configuration management, and how hard it is just to do this type of security of your own systems. So now throw on that third-party risk of either, contractors with access to your systems, or just what are the third-party systems that you're using, the APIs where your data is going to. So we have this whole area of threat and concern that, at least off the top of my head, there's no immediate or easy way we can obviously automate our way out of this, nor even get a good grasp on how worried should we be, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll touch on this a little bit when we get into the open source software, because it's a similar scenario, right? You are dependent on something either you're not managing or building directly. You're relying on components that somebody else built, which is part of the supply chain, or you're relying on people to manage aspects of your infrastructure, which is also a supply chain concern.
I think it's worse here. Well, I think it's actually worse here. With an open source package, you might not want to, but you have the ability to go and look behind the covers and see what's going on. When you're bringing in a third party to help you manage your enterprise, and either in a consultative role or operational role or what have you, you're trusting those people. You're opening a VPN connection or what have you, and you're saying, here, come help me. And you're trusting that they have those components in place to do the right thing. So when it turns out that they're not doing that, and then when, one of the biggest names in InfoSec reporting is, so I don't know about you guys, but I have friends who are sysadmins who barely know security will send me articles from Krebs over the years. This guy's well known. He's got a reputation. I expect someone within Wipro would know that he's coming and looking and knocking on the door. And you don't do this type of thing, right? You have to be honest. And that, to me, that's a huge black mark. So yeah, it's not quite the same as open source. It'd be nice if they had a little more transparency, but it'll be interesting to see how they recover over the next few weeks, I think.
Yeah, and I think speaking of open source, we'll build up to the article Matt was alluding to, but I want to jump in on a couple vulns. One, for example, OpenSSH. So, for example, a well-known service, open source tool that I think pretty much everyone relies on, but it had a pretty interesting flaw in the SCP command, which basically when the command or the server side of a client would send up a glob, like a wildcard, give me every, /star, give me these files. The server would say, sure, here's all the files I'm going to give back to you. And then the client would just trust that server, that file manifest is what was being given back, and would just overwrite into wherever the client was expecting. So it's a little bit of the client and server were trusting each other to initiate the connection, exchanging their keys, authenticating users. But when the client said, give me all these files of this nature or in this location, the server would essentially say, I'm going to give you all these other files over here too, and you're not even going to recognize it. So to me, it was not necessarily the highest risk type of scenario, but kind of an interesting one in the sense that it's sort of it's inverting our expectations of maliciousness, if you will, in the sense that we're connecting to a malicious server that could be doing something to our clients.
Yeah, and it's obviously potential data exfiltration concern here, right? Because it's giving back more than really what was requested also, which is interesting.
I think it's interesting to look at. I think it's interesting to look at this one from the opposite side. Not so much exfiltration, but manipulation. It could be considered a bit of a rootkit in a way. So I say that from the point of view, if you think about more modern cloud systems, where your ops or your admins aren't going in and so much doing the work on the system, but they're copying log files back. Or think about Ansible I'm not sure how SaltStack works, sorry, but I know Ansible, it's an SSH-based model, so it's going to SSH out to that server, grab some data, bring it back. So if I've suddenly got an SSH statement in there that I'm able to either manipulate data or return data back that's unexpected, you can suddenly start having a lot of fun with that, making the server be something different than what people were expecting.
Right, or put in malicious files that through that distribution mechanism now, because it's going to allow me to do it, because it's going to trust that I'm okay, and now I'm putting in maybe some of my own command and control or some other malicious files.
Absolutely, yeah. Lots of good creativity. And I think that speaking of putting malicious files everywhere, I have to admit to a personal bias towards any type of path traversal vulnerability that pops across my radar, just because they're so simple and elegant. Those of you running Confluence servers, hopefully you've upgraded patches to the latest version. Patches have been around since April 5th, so a good 2 weeks at least. But this was, again, just a very simple path traversal that allowed the attacker to drop a file into the web document root. So basically, you could drop a JSP onto the Confluence server path, and then that JSP could simply be a pass-through command. So it's an immediate way to get file traversal to RCE.
Yeah, you like your path traversal vulnerabilities. This is the second one in a couple of weeks where just basic, allows you to get to other places. And this is a pretty, we've known about these for a long time, and here's another example of it.
Yeah, I guess if I'm going to get called out about it, it's also hacking for lazy people, because all you need is a .. slash. So.
Well, I think most humans are lazy, so they'll take the quickest path, right?
Yeah, exactly.
One of the good things though about this compared to say like the SSH issue is with a Confluence, as soon as there's an update available, probably not for the users, but if you log in as an admin, you get a pretty red bar saying, hey, this is something you need to update, or you need to update this now. So at least, as you were saying, like it's been out for what, we're looking 15 days now, I guess, a little over 15 days. People should have some level of going, oh, we need to deal with this, and luckily it's just a few clicks away for them to update. So I at least like that side of it on the good side for Atlassian.
Yeah, it would be really interesting to see over, let's make a comment here and check back in a decade just to see when the big changes are in security UX design. And where is the cool new, what's going to be the RSA Company of the Year for 2020 that's almost just a pure play user experience and just designing messages around security, so people not only just see, yeah, sure, we have to update, but actually are informed and they're encouraged, and the updates just happen much more frequently, or other types of security environments or security actions take place. But if we're going to say path traversal is the easy way, there was another bug that popped up, CVE 2019-0859. That's basically just the fancy way for me to say a new 0 day was reported in a 132k.sys. That's another quote unquote classic use after free bug. So directory traversal might be the easy for web app hacking. Use after free is probably one of the most common within Windows hacking. So this was a Windows bug. It was a local privilege escalation. So it wasn't a necessarily sky is falling because it's remotely exploitable. But I suppose you could, in this day and age, remote can often be relative, especially if we tie this back to something like a outsourcer or your managed service provider who has now local access to your systems, and then can start to execute something like local privilege escalation to get more access to these systems. I think the other reason I wanted to call this out was not so much that, yet it's another Windows 0 day, but maybe let's tie this back to some of the open source availability and talk a little bit about languages, because directory traversal, .. do your, path validation, do your sanitization or your normalization of paths in quote unquote memory unsafe languages or languages like C and C++. The use after free, or any time you're able to do raw memory manipulation or pointer arithmetic, which is always rife with error, please don't do that. But that's why we get these use after free. So we probably will still continue to see these types of bug in Windows, but I do want to put the optimistic spin on this in the sense that, for one, Microsoft is deploying its own fuzzing environment. So that'll be really interesting. And fuzzing is a great way to go after, compiled binaries like this. But we also have better compilers now. So I'm a huge fan of LLVM and Clang. And Clang itself has a bunch of built-in sanitizers for things like undefined behavior, for its address sanitizer, its thread sanitizer, which basically means you can add a couple extra flags when you compile your binary, and you have these sanitizers turned on, and then run your program through either your current user acceptance test, your test environment, or drop them into a fuzzer. And what these sanitizers will do is start to complain about runtime problems. They're going to say, oh, you know what? You actually did something wrong with this integer here, or here's an integer overflow or an integer underflow, which may or may not be a security problem, but it often is. And it also leads to just that idea of code correctness. And when you get into those address sanitizers and the thread sanitizers, those are often much more likely to be those types of security, or to be security problems that may or may not be exploitable, but obviously things you want to fix.
Yeah, there was one more on that. And I didn't get this up into our list, so it's still on my phone. I saw it over the weekend. Microsoft's coming out with a new language called BOSQ, B-O-S-Q-U-E. Based off of, inspired by TypeScript. But the thing that caught my attention is there's no loops in the language. So apparently Microsoft has decided that loops are bad things, or at least Mark Maron, one of their computer scientists. It's interesting. It's so early that I'd consider at this point sort of more of an academic type thing. But I think the idea is it's the same thing like what you're just talking about there, Mike, of how can we make the language I don't want to say idiot proof, but more idiot proof. And obviously getting away from the pointers in the garbage collection helps a lot. And then using some of the tools like you were talking about, but it looks like some of the language developers are trying to help us do this at the same time.
Yeah, so it's definitely a shared pain. And if anyone's felt this pain a lot, it'll be Google, for example. So once you try to build a browser, there's already all kinds of scary things that can go wrong, especially when it's so ubiquitous. In this day and age, we can say nobody really cares about getting root on a system anymore. You just need access into somebody's web browser, exfiltrate cookies, and you have credentialed access to all kinds of things. And let alone dealing with JavaScript, which still has loops and probably will for a long time. So we'll see what happens there. But even Flash. So what Google has been doing, they have an open source project called Sandboxed API. So think of this as like a Docker or container on a much smaller scale. So if you are writing code and using a third-party library, or you need to call into some other third-party binary that you either not sure how much you trust it, or you want to make, or you're not sure the confidence in its security model, you can sandbox it. And essentially, in this case, what that sandboxing means is writing a C++ wrapper for this API into this binary. And the binary now can be restricted to a very, very restricted set of file system accesses and syscalls. So essentially, it's leveraging setconf BPF on Linux to be able to say, this binary is only ever supposed to read these two files and from this directory. It's never supposed to open a network port, and it's never supposed to spawn a process. So by blocking off access to all these syscalls, you can actually make sure that this sandbox, this third-party binary that may be brittle, may be insecure, can execute in a way that is not going to then introduce that much more extra risk onto your system. Or think about it in the sense of you can manage some of the risk of running this binary that you don't really have control over.
Hey, John, does that sound a little familiar to you? Because it sure does to me.
Yeah, I was going to say where's my Michaela Maroney not impressed meme when I need it. So this is, and I actually went through and I started looking at this. It's SecComp. And for those who don't get Matt's joke, this is sort of what I built at Layered Insight to a degree. But so what we do is we inspect the arguments where they're just filing stuff into SecComp. So if you go out and look on the GitHub, they've got some sample code. And it's interesting how they're doing it. I think the biggest, most interesting thing to me is I want to see what type of adoption does this get in the industry, because this is requiring a source code modification. They put a library in front of your code, and then in there you define in a C header file. These are the functions or system calls I want to allow through. But at least from what I've seen so far, you can't do any sanitization. Well, let's not say sanitization. How about filtering based off the arguments being passed? So it's a good start. Don't get me wrong. I mean, this is SecComp. SecComp in some cases slows things down a little bit, but everything does when you add security. So, yeah, I was interested to see Google came out with this. But I'm really curious to see what type of adoption do they get.
Yeah, I mean, the concept is right, which is the concept that we had at Layered Insight, which was the ability to look at a binary, understand what normal behavior is, and enforce that behavior and kind of block out anything that's outside of that so it can't do something malicious like spawn a shell or fork a process or do whatever. So it's that similar concept, which is good because again, we're leveraging a lot of these third-party binaries in our software, and if we can limit what they do to only the things we want them to do, that brings down a level of potential threat or risk to my overall application. It's just how they implement it just sounds really familiar.
Sounds pretty early, and it's at least speaking to that aspect of open source and open source adoption. So yeah, it'll be curious to see how many others use this sandboxing API. But clearly, Matt, you were calling attention to another article about lots of corporations using lots of other open source software.
Yeah, as I was preparing for both shows today, I ran across this on the Business Security Weekly side and I went, no, we should cover this here in the Application Security Weekly side, which is just the growth and adoption of open source. Remember, years back, I mean, we were always building off proprietary systems. What's happened through digital transformation and what we're seeing with the DevOps movement is corporations now embracing more open source. And in this report, 68% growth in adoption of open source in corporations. And only 1% of organizations say, no, we're not going to touch any open source components. That's a major shift from where we were 10, 15 years ago in the environment. And so we've seen it. I mean, all three of us, we've seen this movement, right, in our daily activities and in what we've done for different companies. But to me, it highlights some of the things we have to address from a security perspective. Is we are now relying on third-party components we don't 100% control. Therefore, part of our supply chain could be tainted, and we need the right kinds of tools to inspect these open source libraries, understand how we're going to use them, and make sure that we're putting some controls around how they're being used, just to lessen the potential risk of our applications that are leveraging these components. But we see this all the time. We've seen a lot of this over the past few years.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that's, a good thing and healthy for this is that so many corporations now are major contributors to those open source projects as well. So it's not just, there's a loop too, in the sense of once they become reliant on, very reliant on particular tools, they want to maintain them, just keep that basic architecture going so that these tools can exist for others. And open source has pretty much helped it so that it can be shared and we can actually start to converge on good solutions for common problems, whether it is on the security side like SALT, just being able to, which we didn't go on the technical side of things, but it has just a very simple, elegant pub sub design based on 0MQ. And I just wanted that one, I'd worked with that in my past before, and it's just do something well. Do something simple, do it well, and don't add any extra things to it. And I just like that idea of that, here's an open source tool that can solve one particular problem, but let's not try and overload that problem and solve 10 other things at the same time.
Yeah, I think the other thing you hit on is the corporate support for open source, right? Google's done a really good job at this. Microsoft's acquisition of GitHub and its desire to continue to push open source. Obviously, IBM's Red Hat acquisition is another clear example. So not only are you seeing adoption, you're seeing major corporations that used to be part of the proprietary movement now embracing open source more commercially. And I think that's good not only for the open source community, but I think it's good for organizations that are adopting open source to have some large corporate names behind some of these programs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, if it comes back to from the security side of things, I'd even throw out there React.js has been possibly one of the things that I mention every week or every other week or so, just because it's compelling to me in that sense of it makes it a lot harder to introduce cross-site scripting vulnerabilities into your web front end. So just for that alone makes me excited about it because it's the idea of rather than layering on content security policy headers or WAFs, we've gone through an engineering and a DevOps perspective or angle to solve that type of problem, or at least address that type of problem. And yeah, it's a security issue. It's a security was there, but it's really driven by we want a great, kind of event-driven, high-performance web front end. And oh, by the way, look, we addressed a major security issue while we did it. One other thing, speaking of corporations adopting open source and developers adopting open source, another thing that I saw was this last March, Stanford wrapped up a recent lecture series about computer science, ethics, and public policy. So what was interesting there is highlighting the idea that there's DevOps, then we do need to layer some security on that so we can protect that triad of confidentiality, integrity, availability. And then, of course, there's been privacy with GDPR, with CCPA that's coming up for here in California. But software obviously, isn't created in a vacuum, isn't written in a vacuum. And so it's nice to see as well that computer science courses are starting to emerge that aren't just about this is an array, this is how to do a loop, or I guess the doing loops maybe will be an historical artifact sometime if BOSC continues. But to see ethics and public policy start to be part of that just kind of shows the growing domain of computer science, as well as why don't we pull in domain experts from elsewhere? In other words, rather than engineers trying to solve everything, maybe other people know about these aspects of how software impacts us, or can be built, or should be built. And I just thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, it is an interesting article, and I've seen aspects of these movements before. I think it's just going to take some time for them to make major impacts on where we are in the industry. Unfortunately, there's a lot of us old curmudgeons still about, and we're old dogs. New tricks don't come. But as the new classes start to come through and the new resources start to come in, and we take this a little more seriously, I see this growing over time. I'm just not sure there's enough traction today that makes major impact to the software market quite yet.
Yeah, and I think even when you talk to new grads who say, "Oh, yeah, I took one semester, one secure coding class, and that was it." So we haven't even really fixed just that secure coding aspect of how to tamp down those cross-site scripting, CSRF, those OWASP top 10 basics. So this may be a drop in the bucket, but at least we're maybe continuing to fill the bucket rather than fully regressing. So I have my fingers crossed on this case.
Yeah, it'll grow over time, which is good.
It will. But speaking of time, I think we are just about out of time for today. John, any last thoughts on your side?
Yeah, I want to point out We were talking last week about Google Next, and it turns out Google actually released some containery type stuff after the show. I guess they couldn't quite hit the deadline. We were talking about sandboxing before. They've actually come out with some sandboxing both for GKE as well as, so they now have the ability to sandbox a container within GKE, which is, I think we were talking about that just last week with gvisor. And then binary authorization. So they're actually going to be able to start doing signature verification on binaries within Google. So it's, these are things which, we're hearing customers asking for this and users in general is asking for this. So I'm glad to see them moving in that direction. But since we were talking about Google Next, I figured that was worth dropping in there as a footnote.
Yeah, that's a good call out, especially that binary authorization of who submitted the source, who built this, when was it built, and does this binary actually match the source code? Again, it's one of those things that's a very simple narrative, but when you poke at it, there's a lot of areas where that falls down, and it's a lot more complex than than at first glance. So that's absolutely a fun thing to see and to be following to see that how well it's being done and that it's being done right.
And it is being done right. It's they're not using, I just have to look up the name, they're using Cridus from Grapheus, which is one of Google's 10 million open source projects, since we were talking about that. They're not using Docker's trusted content, which I think a lot of us are starting to realize that it sounded good initially. The implementation leaves some stuff to be desired. So DockerCon's coming up next week. Maybe we'll hear some improvements there around that on the security side, but generally moving forward, yeah.
Yeah, good call. So we'll pay attention to DockerCon as well as hopefully that KubeCon and Cloud Native Con come and everybody signs up for that, because I have to admit that's a tongue twister to try to get through for that announcement. But please join us there. And I think that's going to wrap this up for this week. So thanks again, and we'll see you next week on Application Security Weekly.